if it's starting, if I gotta go gray and then come back, that's what it is. It's a phone app.
Okay. I'm gonna, there's a few people in the waiting room, so I'm gonna let them in if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our event today. My name is Mary and I'm an adult programming librarian. To let you all know, this is being recorded to be posted later online. We are also live on Facebook. We are keeping everyone's cameras and mics off, and we will leave a few minutes at the end for questions if you have any, at which time you can put your question in the chat, and I'll give you the option to turn your mics on. Welcome again to our event where renowned author and storyteller Tally Johnson will tell us spine-tingling ghost stories for the Halloween season. Mr. Johnson is a graduate of Spartanburg Methodist College and Wofford College with degrees in history. He's the author of many books, including The Ghosts of South Carolina Upcountry, Ghosts of the South Carolina Midlands, Ghosts of the PD and Civil War Ghosts of South Carolina, and has short stories in Off the Beaten Path 3 and Tales from the Old Black Ambulance. His books can be found on Amazon. And at the end of the presentation, I will post the link for those books. He is on the roster of approved artists as an author, as well as South Carolina School Librarians List of Storytellers. He's been a guest at many cons, including Fandom Fest, MonsterCon, MysticCon, Imaginarium, as well as a storyteller at several festivals, schools, and libraries all over South Carolina. Without further ado, here is Tally Johnson.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate y'all having me this afternoon. I'm gonna do a couple of stories from the Anderson area, and then I'm just gonna do some from South Carolina in general, if that suits you. And I've got one kind of creepy one that I'll ask about before I do that one. So anyway, happy Saturday, everybody. First story I'm gonna do is probably the best known story from Anderson. It's High Shoals Bridge off High Shoals Road. You probably know it better as Crybaby Bridge. The story there is kind of like the story for all the other Crybaby Bridges around the world, pretty much. Back in the 1940s, a lady was coming to meet her husband. He'd just gotten out of the service. She was coming from one of the plants at Anderson to meet him at the house. And they were rainy night, slick road. And she was in a hurry with the baby in the back of the car and came up on the bridge, and supposedly she was thrown from the car when they wrecked, and the baby went out the other side. And if you go to the bridge, which is now closed to traffic, if I remember right, you have to cut your car off while you're sitting there in the dark, and you may either hear a baby cry or you may get especially lucky and see the mother in a white dress pacing the length of the bridge. And you may even get lucky enough to have your car stall out when you are there. Since the bridge is pretty much closed down to traffic, what I did when I was doing research for the Ghost of the Upcountry book was I stopped on the side and I walked over the bridge and stood there for about 5-10 minutes. And sadly, I didn't hear the baby cry, but I've heard from folks when I was in Anderson for Starburst a few years ago. I heard from multiple people that have heard the baby and a couple that have even seen the mother. So now, if you go, I would be very careful. I'm not sure the bridge is in 100% shape, so just be careful and be safe if you go. And that's about all the advice I can really give you on that one. Another real well-known story from Anderson County is Hunter's Store up near Pendleton, in Pendleton. Been there since 1850. It was basically a general store for a little bit of everything for the planters in the area. Um, 2-story. In the top story, there was an apartment. I think the owner's family lived there early on, and then they let the caretaker stay if they had a late night party or some such. Basically, one night a guy went out on a very cold night in 1894 and had a little bit too much to drink, and I expect it was probably something a little stronger than beer. Set out, rode off on his horse, fell off into the creek nearby, and basically, after the party he was at broke up, folks found him in the creek, brought him back to the store, and put him up in the apartment, hoping that he would just dry off, sober up, and leave. However, that May was one of those weird Mays that had a record cold snap, and since the window was up upstairs, he froze to death. And it even dates basically the event. It was May 19th, and supposedly on the wall you can read the date, and it's very cold next to it. And I think the building is now a like a visitor center for the Pendleton area, and people have heard footsteps upstairs, things being moved, things getting thrown on the floor, and when they go upstairs, nothing's been disturbed. And the noises come from upstairs. People have seen a man with curly brown hair and a beard wearing an old-fashioned suit coming down the stairs, hiding in corners, and walking behind furniture. Doesn't seem like he's caused any particular trouble for anybody, but it's a bit disconcerting to say the least if you're walking around at work and all of a sudden look up, there's a strange guy standing in a corner somewhere. Unlike some of the ghosts I've run into, he hasn't shown any signs for wanting to touch anybody or anything else. He just kind of walks around. If I had to guess, he's probably a little bit confused about why he's stuck in what he knows is a general store that's now been turned in basically into an office. So, which would confuse everybody, not just me. The 3rd story from up Anderson area is over in Powdersville off Three Bridges Road. Now, when Powdersville was founded in 1859, it was the site of a powder mill. They made gunpowder, and they stored gunpowder there during the Civil War. It wasn't the main depot. Columbia was where they actually poured most of it. The ghost on Three Bridges Road is a slave named Eloise, when Sherman's troops basically fanned out throughout South Carolina in 1865, she was with her master on or near Three Bridges Road when the bummers, the people who were out foraging for Sherman's troops, basically decided to rob him of whatever cash he had on hand. He resisted, and they shot him. And since Eloise was loyal to her master, she stayed with him. And rather than risk having a witness, the soldiers shot her as well. And now people have seen her walking down the road. They've also heard her screams just before she was shot. But I will warn you, if you go down Three Bridges Road looking for her, given the way Powdersville has grown up in the last couple of decades, and I've been through there going camping up in Oconee County in the mountains, the odds are really, really good that you won't hear her screaming over the traffic, and the odds are even better that you won't see her given all the lights. You can go and give it a shot, but I don't hold out much hope for Eloise being noticed anymore, which is a shame, but that's one of the things that happened with ghost stories throughout the state, nation, and world. You have growth in one place, and a story that's been around for 50 or 60 years just kind of fades out because there's no way to see them anymore. Like I say, I am prone to go camping. I sleep in a hammock because I'm getting to be old and arthritic, and my back doesn't like hard ground anymore. So, and it's fun. I enjoy it. It kind of keeps me in shape, such as it is. And you don't expect to find ghosts at a campsite, but I've been lucky, I guess is the word for it. One spring afternoon, just about 3 years ago now, me and my friend Bill decided we were going to go do a section of the Palmetto Trail, which runs throughout the state, called the Peak to Prosperity Passage. Say that 3 times fast. And basically, it's an old rail trail between Newberry and Columbia, about 5 miles to the campsite one way, and it goes over Broad River on a long trestle that just predates just after the Civil War. And then you go around on the tracks and you go over the little bridges and things, and it's really, really pretty. And we get to the campsite probably about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. We set up our hammocks with the tarps over them and everything so we don't get sprinkled on. And we had the gas-fired stoves, and we cook our food in a bag, and we sit around and talk. And right at dark, we decide we're going to sack out because it's supposed to rain cats and dogs in the morning. We want to try to get back to the car before we get soaked. It didn't work out that way. I'll give you that spoiler now. Anyway, right at dark, we go to bed, and I listen to my iPod because, well, there's no cell service in the middle of nowhere. And I finally doze off about 10 o'clock. And for some reason, about 12:30, my eyes pop open. And it takes me a second to figure out where I'm at because I've been sleeping so hard. And once my brain begins to process, I look up, and there's a face about 2 inches from mine in my hammock. White gentleman, probably in his early 60s. I can see the salt and pepper stubble on his chin. He's got a mole under his right eye and a horrible looking gash that goes from temple to temple on his forehead. And yeah, I'll spare you the details in case there are any little kids running around. And I don't even have enough thought process to scream. I'm just staring at him. And I feel a cold chill, and I assumed that meant he walked through me, and that was the end of it. To say the least, I did not get any more sleep that night. I sat on a picnic table playing on my iPod until morning. And of course, Bill slept through the entire thing, snoring like a freight train. And I get back home that Sunday, and I go on the internet like everybody does. And I start Googling accidents because my first thought was that the gentleman had been killed in a train wreck on the railroad. Hadn't been any wrecks. But I remember that behind the campsite, there was a field. I'm assuming back years ago, must have been planted in cotton. And I came across that thing in the state paper where a gentleman had a tractor fall over on top of him. And when it fell, it took off his right arm and cut up his face really, really bad. And he staggered from the field to the railroad tracks where he tried to flag down the train. But they thought he was just waving hello and went by, and then he passed away next to the railroad tracks. The day of the accident was the day me and my friend Bill went camping. So, to say the least, I have not yet been back to the Peak Prosperity Trail campsite. But 99.99% of the time, if you go camping in the woods, you're not going to have a ghost bother you. Speaking of woods, one of my favorite spots to go do, I guess, paranormal investigation, because I hate the word ghost hunting, because I don't know where you'd put a stand to ghost hunt. I don't know if you could put a ghost head on the wall like you could a deer. You can't eat them, so I don't understand why people call it ghost hunting. Plus, I don't even know what the season is for ghost hunting. But one of my favorite places to go is a place called Poinsett Bridge, which is off of Highway 11 up near Tigersville. I'm sorry. Tigersville is Clemson. But Poinsett Bridge is a stone arch bridge that goes over Gap Creek. And it was built in 1825 and named for Joel R. Poinsett, who brought the poinsettia from Mexico to the U.S. when he was minister to Mexico. And it's a very beautiful bridge, classic stone archwork, built by slave labor. And that's important because one of the reported ghosts at Poinsett Bridge is people hear voices speaking a foreign language. And I've read in one book where the voices are those of Chinese laborers who built the bridge. And that's one reason why I wrote my first book, was to kind of correct some of these mistakes, because Chinese labor built railroads in the western United States after the Civil War. But in South Carolina in 1825, you had slaves who were probably first and second generation Africans from Africa, not born in South Carolina. And of course, if your boss has power of life and death over you, or can actually do physical violence to you for not working hard enough to suit or whatever, you're not going to talk about your boss in English. You're going to use a language they don't understand. So that would make sense that they're speaking a dialect like Igbo or Kinsala, or another African language as opposed to English. Another haunting at Poinsett are various lights have been seen floating across the bridge coming up from the creek. And it's in a beautiful spot. It's wooded. There's a parking area across the little gravel road from the bridge. And I highly recommend going, taking pictures and everything. I can't promise you a ghost, but it's a really, really cool spot. And it's pretty close. And apparently, ghosts in my family are apparently a tradition. I did ghost stories at the library in Lyman, which is where I'm originally from, about 2 years ago. And my grandfather, who passed away this spring, finally came to hear me do my ghost stories. And we were at supper afterwards, and he says, I wish I'd known you were into ghosts, because I'd have told you the story about what happened to me in World War II. And I'm like, Grandpa, how is this news? You've got copies of all my books signed to you. And I just laughed, because I knew he was probably pulling my chain. And he said, yeah, I was in the Philippines running a landing craft right after the American invasion, looking for Japanese troops who had not yet surrendered. And I was working in the engine room one night. I was manning the engine, and a voice, we were going top speed through a gulf between two islands. And all of a sudden, a voice came down the speaking tube from the bridge and said, "Full stop." And being in the Navy in World War II, Grandpa pulled the handle and stopped the boat. Immediately thereafter, another voice came down the speaking tube, giving him up the country because why the bleep, bleep, bleep did you stop the boat? We're supposed to make landfall in an hour. You're going to make us late, blah, blah, blah. And then he heard a conversation on the bridge where someone said, sir, there's a 40-foot mine less than 100 yards from the bow of the ship. And for whatever reason, the voice came back down and said, carry on. Full reverse. So they backed up and went around the mine. And it turned out, Grandpa was talking to some shipmates, and it turned out that the previous captain had passed away of a heart attack on the boat, on the bridge a few months before. And they asked him to describe the voice, and it was a distinct Boston accent. And the skipper they had at the incident happened was from Iowa. And Grandpa said, yeah, the voice sounded weird to me because he talked funny. And Grandpa was convinced that the previous captain had given him the order to stop the boat so it didn't get sunk by the mine. And so, thank you, Captain, whoever you were, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. And that same night, my mother told me that she had had a paranormal experience, and that I had too, but I was only about a year old when it did happen. We were living in a mill village house in a place called Jackson Mills, which is near Spartanburg. And my dad worked for the mill at the time, and my mom was home with me. And she was up one night watching Johnny Carson. And for you younger folks, Johnny Carson was kind of like Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon combined, but funnier. And he was basically the only thing you could watch after the news went off. Mom's sitting on the couch in the living room watching TV when the front door of the house flies open. And she hears this scrape of metal on the hardwood floor going down the hall to the bedrooms. I'm in my crib, apparently, in one bedroom, and Mom and Dad's room across the hall. The room to the door I'm in flies open, and after about 20 seconds, the scraping comes back up the hall, and she hears somebody go thump on the front porch. Well, to say the least, Dad got off work at midnight, came home to an empty house and a note. Me and my mom had gone to my great grandmother's house to spend the night, and the next morning plans were made for us to move. And Mom talked to the realtor who'd rented them the house, and the realtor finally confessed that in the 1930s, the people who owned the house then, the husband worked second shift and the wife worked first shift at the mill. The wife and her boss started to see each other, and one evening he came to the house. They were behaving inappropriately. The husband got off work early, saw the boss's car, grabbed the axe off the porch he used to split wood for the wood stove, drug it down the hall, kicked in the bedroom door, killed them both with the axe, drug the axe back up the hall, sat down on the front steps and waited for the sheriff to come arrest him, which did not take long given the amount of screaming that had been done. And apparently, according to friends from high school and other things, I've heard that story from other people, but I had never put together that I was living in the house when he came back. So I've been around ghosts for a very long time, apparently. But not all ghosts are creepy or have blood dripping off and all this stuff or come back for revenge. About 25 years ago, I'm laying in my bed in my apartment here in Chester. And it's the night before I'm supposed to get married. And I have been stressed out about the wedding because I'm very young. My wife was very young. And it's just jitters, are we going to work out? Can we support each other financially? Can we make it work? The whole thing. And there have been issues with groomsmen Stuxes not having buttons. One guy's shirt was 3 sizes too small. Another guy's pants were 2 sizes too big. They looked like clown pants, the whole thing. So I'm stressed out and I'm laying in my bed and I have a big glass of tea about this size, sitting next to my hip on the bed, and I'm reading a big, thick reference book just to clear my mind, get ready to go to bed. And from my bed, it's a 4-room apartment, and I can see the hallway and my fridge from my bedroom. And I don't know how many of y'all live in apartments, but when you get an apartment and it has a sliding glass door, all the locks come pre-broken. None of the locks on a sliding glass door work. So everybody has a broomstick that's cut off to sit in the track of that door, so you can't open it. And I have one of those in mine. And the neighborhood's not real great, so I have 2 deadbolts on my front door. And yes, I checked them before I went to bed. About midnight, I look up, and there's a guy standing in front of my refrigerator. But he's looking at the refrigerator, not at me. So being a sizable person and a bit of a redneck, if you can't tell from my distinct Brooklyn accent, I jump up and begin to holler various and sundry things related to why you're in my house and what I'm going to do to you when I get my hands on you. And was about 5'7", probably in his 70s, wearing an orange and white trucker hat, brown jacket, and gray pants. And I can see the arm of one of his glasses going over one ear. And about the time I hit my bedroom door, and of course the drink goes all over the bed, the book falls off and breaks a toe on my left foot. He turns and looks at me full face, and I freeze. It's my great grandfather who'd passed away about 15 years before in Lyman. Had never been to Chester in his life, as far as I know, and had never been in this apartment for sure. He just looks at me for a second, dips his cap, and walks towards my front door. And again, it takes my brain a second to get in gear. And I finally work out who he is. And I'm like, oh no, we've got things to catch up on, old man. You've missed 15 years. There's been all kinds of stuff that's gone on. And as soon as I turn the corner, he's gone. The house is still dark except for the light behind me. Everything's where it's supposed to be. But I notice as I go back to bed to flip the mattress to go to sleep, since it's soaking wet, that I feel better about the whole being married thing. It's going to work out. Everything's fine. The groomsmen will get their tuxes straight before the wedding that night. I'm not worried anymore. And it must have worked out for the best because almost 25 years later, we're still married. And happily so. So sometimes ghosts are a good thing. Now, if you've read my books, thank you. I mean, if you haven't, go get them. But one thing I do in my books is I try to go to all the places that I have stories for. And I give you the story that's supposed to happen. And then I tell you what happened when I went, which sometimes it's the same thing and sometimes not. Well, and sometimes I get lucky and I find a ghost where there hasn't been one. When I was working on the book Ghost of the South Carolina Midlands, which covers the area down near Aiken and North Augusta and that part of the state, south of Anderson, I did a 12-hour road trip. I left my house in Chester about 7 o'clock that morning and drove all day. And I would go to a place and I would see what would happen. And I stopped at some of the libraries along the way in Abbeville, Edgeville, places to double check facts and this kind of thing. This is a research trip. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd had lunch and I am tired of the car. I need a break. I need to stretch my legs, the whole thing. So I ride up on Rivers Bridge State Historic Site down near Bamberg. And I'm like, you know what? State parks have really good trails. It won't take me long. I can do the trail, stretch my legs, get revigorated. The only drawback is it's high August in South Carolina in the low country. So it's hot. It's like 95 degrees, 95% humidity, and every bug in the free world is out. So I'm like, we're going to do this trail really quick because I don't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes. I park in the parking area. I've got the entire place to myself. And I get out of the car and I go down the little trail and I'm reading all the historical markers and the informational signs. And I go through the trenches where the Confederates were. Because the reason Rivers Bridge is notable is early January 1865, Sherman finally leaves Savannah. General Sherman is a Union general, South Carolina's the reason for the whole Civil War because we fired on Fort Sumter and left the Union. No one knows where Sherman is going. Is he going to Charleston to get revenge for Fort Sumter? Is he going to Columbia? Is he coming north towards Anderson to get powder and all this stuff? What's he going to do? Well, he finally leaves Savannah and arrives at Rivers Bridge on the Salkehatchie River. And the Confederates have 1,200 men, most of whom were either teenagers or senior citizens, against 7,000 picked troops who have been fighting Confederates since they left Chattanooga the year before. And they've taken Savannah, they've burned everything from Atlanta to the sea, marched to the sea and all that. And they try to cross a bridge and a ford on the river, and the Confederates let loose with cannon fire and all this from one cannon. And the battle lasted one day. Finally, Sherman says, you know what, let's go upriver about a half a mile. There's another bridge, and they bypassed the Confederates. Wound up burning Columbia, looting plantations, freeing slaves, just like they did in South Georgia. And in April that year, Lee surrenders. Johnson surrenders in Bentonville. The war's over. And Rivers Bridge is the only place in South Carolina where there was organized resistance to Sherman on his march after Savannah. And like I said, battle happened in February. I'm there in August, middle of August. And I go down and I go through the trenches and I get to the Blackwater Swamp off Salkehatchie. And I am in a polo shirt, cargo shorts, and sandals. Because, well, I've lived in South Carolina for almost 50 years. I know it's hot. And I look up and I see a guy in a blue wool jacket, shoulder length blonde hair, and a big thick mustache, wading in a black water swamp. I'm like, dude, there are snakes. There are probably alligators. Heaven only knows what else in that water. So, being the good Southern boy that I am, I say, hey, y'all gonna want to get out of that. About the time I open my mouth and tell him, he throws his arms out and falls backwards into the water. There is no splash. There is no sound, anything else. And I've noticed, again, it takes my brain a second, that if you walk in waist deep water, there's normally like a weight behind you where you move through the water. There wasn't any. And it dawns on me that I have seen the death of a Union soldier from 130 something, 40 something years ago at that point. And I'm done. I turn around, go back up the hill, get in the car, and leave. When I get back on Highway 3 towards civilization, I call my wife and I'm like, I finally found me a ghost on this trip. And my poor wife has been putting up with me and ghosts since we've been dating. She's like, that night, what time are you going to be home? Because you've been gone a long time. And when I finally get home, I tell her the story. She's much more impressed than she was on that initial phone call. So, but if you go to Rivers Bridge State Park, I have to tell you, if you ask the park ranger about the haunting at the park, he will tell you very simply there are no ghosts in any South Carolina state parks or any national park sites in South Carolina. So, do with that what you will. Excuse me. The book I'm working on right now is a book of Revolutionary War ghosts from South Carolina, because if you aren't a native of South Carolina and haven't had South Carolina history in school, you may not know that South Carolina was the site of the most battles and skirmishes between loyalists and, at the time, rebels against the British Crown of any state in the 13 colonies. We had the most battles and probably the most generalized violence of any state. And naturally, that kind of bloodshed between neighbors leaves a mark. And one of the weirder stories I found, and this story is in my book, Goes to the PD. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, there's a scene during one of the battles where a cannonball completely beheads a guy, and you can see the cannon fires. The cannonball comes towards you on the screen and basically goes through you. It's a very cool scene. And I did not realize when I saw the movie in the theater that it's apparently based on a piece of folklore. Over near Camden, there's a place called Hobkirk's Hill, which was one of the battles fought to try to relieve British pressure on Charleston, so if we could try to retake Charleston and then the war in the South. And it was 1781, if my memory serves right. During that battle, a American officer riding on horseback, sword in his hand, leading his troops, gets decapitated by a cannonball in the same way. The horse never stopped. The horse went up the hill, body still holding on to his stirrups, to the reins on the horse, feet in the stirrups, runs right by the cannons and just keeps going into the woods. Apparently, if you're in the area around the time of the battle, you will see a horse that is now a skeleton riding around in the area around Black Creek. carrying the same American officer. He is intact except for his head missing. He still has his sword up, but he's riding on a skeletal horse. And the story that I heard from folks down in Camden is that when the horse finally goes to dust, when all the bones are gone, the world we're in. So I'm really hoping that I never see the horse, because I'm afraid that he will start missing bones and things will start looking bad for the rest of us. But there are dozens of stories about Revolutionary War ghosts in the state. So I'm really looking forward to getting that book out hopefully next year. But I've noticed that some of the best stories aren't necessarily real ghost stories. They don't necessarily have a ghost attached. An example of this is one of the first investigations I went on when I was a teenager. There's a place near Spartanburg called the Tanning Yard. And the Tanning Yard is a little place near Fair Forest. It's a beautiful little spot. You've got a big railroad trestle going over a creek. And the creek is gorgeous. It's got a rock bottom. And the bridge at the time was a little wooden bridge with barely little 2x4 tracks on either side so you didn't run off in the creek. And it was pitch black, and it was a great spot to go. People hunted down there and did the usual high school shenanigans. But one night after church, me and about a dozen of my friends decided we were going to go check it out. So you have a dozen high school aged boys piling into a Ford Ranger pickup, which is about the size of a Hot Wheel. And we go off to the woods. Now, the story at the Tanning Yard is far-fetched. There are about 8 or 9 high schools in Spartanburg County. Supposedly back in the early 70s, a bunch of Satanists had gotten together and decided that they were going to sacrifice a virgin from each high school to raise some demon to cause some kind of trouble. And supposedly the last girl they kidnapped managed to escape from the altar and ran down the creek screaming in a white nightgown for help. And they managed to catch her just before she got to the bridge and drug her back to the house. Well, there are no demons in Spartanburg. The story is a complete and utter lie. Sounds really good if you're in high school looking for a way to scare yourself, but it's a lie. So fast forward 15 years, the 12 of us are in the truck, and the late 80s were a very different time, boys and girls. I'm riding, sitting on the tailgate in the middle, which is not safe. Don't ever do that. And what you're supposed to do to conjure up the girl in the white nightgown is you park your car on the old wooden bridge and you blow your horn 3 times. Well, it's about 8:30 at night. I would say probably around between November, between Halloween and Thanksgiving. We stop, bam, 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 and a lady in white appears on the other side of the railroad trestle under a streetlight. She is not a beautiful young teenage girl. She's probably in her 40s or 50s, wearing a white nightgown. And she's cussing at us for all she's worth. And all of a sudden, we all hear, like someone has loaded a double-barrel shotgun. And about that time, the guy driving the truck freaks out and floors it. And a friend of mine throws his arms back and says, "Oh, Lord," smacking me in the chest. I fall off the tailgate onto the wooden bridge on my back like a turtle. And as the taillights fade off into the distance, I hear that the lady is still screaming and cussing, and I hear boom, where she has fired off one of the barrels into the night. At this point, I'm done. I crawl under the bridge, huddle up, and I'm getting soaking wet. And I sit there for what seems like an hour. She finally gives up in disgust, goes back to the house. I can hear the door slam from probably a half mile away. And after a few more minutes, the truck comes back and I get in. I look at the guy driving and I begin to call him everything but a child of God and a friend of mine. I am not a happy camper. And he politely explains that he had to take everybody else on because he was afraid that the lady had shot his truck. And I very unpolitely explained that I have sat for the last half hour in a creek in the fall, and I have soaked my rear end, my front end, my top end, and my bottom end, waiting for him to come back to get me. And I don't care that his seat's wet. I don't care his mama's going to be mad. I'm mad enough for the both of them, and he can do various sundry horrible things. He drops me off. We're all fine. The next day, we're getting along like teenage boys usually do. So, but the moral of that story is, if you're going to go do something stupid related to ghosts, make sure you drive or always keep the car keys. Because if you don't, you'll wind up getting left. That's just the way of the world. You'll wind up being left somewhere to your own devices. Probably the best known ghost in South Carolina is the Gray Man of Pawleys Island. Those of you who don't know, Pawleys is down near the coast south of Myrtle Beach. And the Gray Man appears before major hurricanes make landfall, come ashore. If you are fortunate enough to see him, your house or wherever you're staying will be spared the effects of the storm. I have heard when Hugo came ashore that a witness saw him the day before they evacuated. And when they evacuated for about 2 weeks and came back, their house was intact to the point where the towels they had left laying on the porch rail were still there. And their neighbor's house was gone down to the concrete slab it had been built on. Now, for years and years, there was speculation that no one knew who the Gray Man really was. Well, I'm proud to say that in Civil War Ghost of South Carolina, I think I figured out who he was. He was a man named Plowden Charles Jenneret Weston. He owned most of Pawleys Island, including the Pelican Hen and different other houses on the island, and had about 10,000 acres of rice land under cultivation by slaves. Tremendously popular with his neighbors, practically beloved. He goes to Virginia with Confederate troops, comes down with tuberculosis, and comes home. And by acclamation, his friends in the state senate elect him lieutenant governor. He dies 6 months later, much mourning, everything else. And he would have been forgotten except for the fact that the Sea Island hurricane of 1893 came in, and multiple witnesses reported seeing him pacing up and down the beach before the storm. And they took that as a sign that it was time to go. And when they came back, their houses were intact. The curious thing is how a guy who died in 1864 reappears now wearing a gray one-piece coverall suit like you'd wear if you were working on a car or out in the field somewhere. I have yet to quite figure that out, but I'm pretty sure that given the fact that no one has said seen the Gray Man before the Civil War, and the first real reports are 1893 when that big hurricane came through. I'm pretty confident that it's plowed in the west. I could be wrong. The only way you can really find out is to go down to the coast before a hurricane and walk Follies Island and see if you see him. And if you happen to see him, you might decide to ask him who he is. And if you find out, do let me know, because it's one of the great mysteries of ghosts in South Carolina. Probably the other most famous ghost in South Carolina is also down near Follies Island, and her name is Alice Flagg. I joke that Alice is my girlfriend because I've spent so much time talking about her over the last 20 odd years. Alice Flagg was the sister of Dr. Allard B. Flagg, and they were the heirs to a sizable rice plantation down near Georgetown. And she was one of the most eligible debutantes in the area around 1845. Her older brother was her guardian because her parents had both passed away when she was very young. And as a Southern boy, I can tell you that when mom and dad are gone, big brother is always in charge. And I say that as an older brother. My little sister, my little brother would probably argue that fact, but I stand by what I said. Older brother is always in charge when mom and daddy are gone. So he decides to make her a proper and fit plantation wife. She needs to go to school, so he sends her to school in Charleston to a lady named Madame Tavon, who trains up young women in the way they should act and what they need to know to manage a plantation, be a good dancer and good companion and all this stuff. Well, while she's in Charleston, she meets an Irish carpenter named Edward O'Brien and falls madly in love. He's a big guy, he's probably about 6'2", 6'3". Been working outside, so he's tan, he's muscular from doing manual labor, big red hair, big bushy red beard. And they get married at St. Finbarr's Cathedral in Charleston on the down low. And he gives her a ring engraved on the inside, "To my wife, Alice, love, EOB." And she wears it on a chain around her neck because she's a little bit young and she knows her brother would not approve. She comes home for Christmas. Her brother says, "Good news and congratulations." And she's like, "Huh? Have you heard something that you're not supposed to know about?" He says, "I have found you a husband. He's a neighbor of ours. He's about 75 years old. You'll be his third wife, and he's got kids old enough to be your mom and daddy. But if he passes away and you're married to him, we inherit his 50,000-acre plantation. So it's great. Congratulations. And by the way, you're getting married right after New Year's." This is about a week before Christmas, and Alice is like, "Yeah, great, fabulous. You can only have one at the time, and I've already got one, but yay, that's great." So Alice, being on the coast, gets bitten by a mosquito and comes down with yellow fever. Well, her brother's her doctor, and he's trying to figure out what's wrong with her, how to treat it. And while he's examining her, he finds a ring around her neck on a chain, sees the inscription, and loses his mind. He snatches it off her neck, throws it out the open window into the rice field behind the house, and is not happy. One of the end-stage symptoms of yellow fever is you begin to hallucinate, and Alice is talking to her husband like he's there, he's not. And she starts clawing at her neck, "My ring, where's my ring?" And her brother doesn't pay her any attention, and right before New Year's, Alice passes away and is buried in her wedding at All Saints Episcopal Church off Highway 17, south of Myrtle Beach. Church is still there. It's an active church. Don't go on Sunday during church service. After Alice passed away, the field directly behind the house began to lie fallow. Because when slaves would be working in that area just before dark, they would report seeing a lady in a green dressing gown floating about a foot above the black water, muddy water that the rice was growing in. And she would float up to them and she would have this heartbroken look on her face. And she would ask, my ring, help me find my ring. And of course, being field slaves, they were obliged to help. But when they spoke to the girl, she would vanish in front of their eyes. So eventually, slaves stopped working that field. Dr. Flagg gave up however many 100 acres, however many acres it was, worth of rice. Now, the Hermitage is a private residence. Don't go messing around it. It's not publicly accessible. But you can go to the church cemetery. Now, the church is also where Governor Carroll Campbell is buried if you need another reason to go visit. But when you go in the cemetery gate, on the right-hand side, there's a slab grave about 6 by 4 feet. On the grave is simply inscribed Alice. Another reason you can't miss it is there'll be a pile of rings in the middle of the grave. And what you have to do if you want Alice to meet you, especially if you're a young lady, if you're engaged, walk around her grave 13 times, hold your hand out and say, Alice, Alice, I have your ring. Regardless of how much your fiance spent on your ring, regardless of how good it's sized, how tight it fits your finger, you will feel it slide down your finger. And if you're not careful, it will fall off onto the slab. About 10 years ago, my friend Bill and his then fiance, who's my wife's best friend and my wife, went to the beach for the weekend, and I convinced them to let's go see Alice. And we're wandering around the cemetery and all this. And I convinced Susan to do the ritual, walk around the 13 times, hold her ring out. And I warned her, going to the church, let's go by Dollar Tree and get one of the cheapy throwaway rings because you don't want to lose your time. Oh, that's all a lie. Nothing's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So we get there and I'm wandering around the cemetery and I notice while I'm away from the grave over towards Carroll Campbell's grave, which is on the other side of the cemetery, I feel someone run their fingers through my hair, the back of my head. So I'll whip my head around and nobody's there. My wife's over at Alice's grave and Susan. And as I'm walking back, I walk through this cloud of wisteria, which has that distinct smell. If you've ever smelled it, you know exactly what it is. And I look around and there are no wisteria bushes or vines anywhere in sight. I mean, I haven't seen one coming down the road from the church. There's not any in the cemetery, but it is like I have walked into one of those tester clouds at the mall Christmas shopping. I mean, it's just all over. It's like going up to a teenage kid with Axe body spray. I have been vaporized. And I walk up and my wife and Susan are frantically looking around in the dirt, going through the pile of little costume jewelry rings on the grave, desperately trying to find the ring. And I'm like, oh, what happened? We lost the ring. The ring came off. The ring came off. And I said, but it was a lie, right? There's nothing to this. It's all a lie. And I look down and the ring is shining in the daylight. And I reach down, pick it up. Is this it? Yes. And my friend Bill's like, how dare you? Dare you? Try to lose my wife's ring. And I'm like, dude, I didn't have anything to do with her losing her ring. That was her bad. So if you go, like I say, don't go on Sundays during church. That's not polite. And actually, it's just rude. That's all you have to do. You don't have to do any dancing. You just walk around 13 times. And because they do the track, you cannot miss the little dirt circle around the grave. Hold that ring out, and it'll slide off. Like I said, go to Dollar Tree and just buy a cheaper ring. You'll come out way ahead and be a whole lot happier than you would otherwise. I'll do one more quick one. Maybe I'll do. I may do two because I like y'all. Yeah, I do too. The only place I've ever had any kind of physical encounter with a ghost is at the old Powell Theater here in Chester. It used to be a movie theater. Then in the 70s, the little theater, the troupe moved in and they did plays there for years. And I was in a couple. And there were a bunch of ghosts in the theater. There were lights that float up and down the stage. People have heard voices when the theater is closed. When the theater is not being used for rehearsal, they make sure they kill the main power breaker in the rear of the building. People still see lights. There's a little bathroom backstage where you can take care of pre-show nerves and you can wash your makeup off after the show. And people have been in there and heard on the brick wall behind the toilet. And it turned out that in the early 80s, someone was killed and thrown into the dumpster behind the theater. And on the anniversary of the death, you can hear the body hitting the wall. So you've had that. I have been in there because, I'm a guy. I don't wear makeup all the time. I don't know how you ladies do it. I'm trying to get makeup off my face from being on stage. And I have cold cream on my face and all this stuff, and it's running in my eyes, and I can't see it. I can taste it. And then the chain light in the ceiling, you just pull a little cord, and a little bare light bulb comes up. So I'm in the bathroom's about the size of a computer. It's not big. And I hear click, and it goes black. And I'm like, oh. So I reach back, pull the light back on, and I finally get my face clean. And I go out, get ready to go out the door, which locks on the inside with one of those hook and eye locks. And I go out, and the door won't open. And it feels like somebody's leaning against it. You know how you're playing the joke on somebody, I'm going to block the door. And I'm yanking on it, and I'm cussing, and I'm beating on it. And after about 10 seconds, boop, I go out, and I'm as white as a sheet. And people backstage are like, they got you, did they? And I'm like, yeah, I guess they did. Who? The ghost. And one night we go on an investigation at the theater, and another one of the stories is there's a projection booth in the back that's out of use, the old projectors in the Historical Society Museum here in town. But people have heard that they have smelled the pipe tobacco that the projection is smoked. And you can hear the slapping of the film reel that's run out at the end of the movie. So we go in there, and there's a recessed light fixture in the ceiling. Well, one of the guys I'm with decides to be a smart aleck and flips the light switch. And all the pigeons in the world come out of that light fixture. There are probably half a dozen grown people, and we run screaming down the stairs, out the front door, into the parking lot, screaming like banshees as all these pigeons chase us and fly off into the road. Right after that, the same guy says, do me a favor and go check the alley door and make sure it's locked. We don't want any homeless guys coming in here after we leave and trashing the place. I'm like, okay. And it's little 6 steps to a landing and then 6 more steps. And they were probably put in back in the 30s. You know, they're concrete, they've got tile on them, and then they've got little metal lips about yay wide going down the steps. Well, I politely walked down the stairs and I hit the landing. And I walk into a choke slam. Basically, somebody picks me up by the neck about 3 or 4 inches off the ground, and I'm still walking. And they're squeezing on my neck, and I feel myself being choked. And all of a sudden, I get slapped across the face to the point where you can see the handprint. And the guy behind it seems like it's gone on for half an hour. I'm sure it wasn't, but about 5-10 seconds. The guy reaches out, grabs my belt, and pulls me back. Again, I'm a redneck. I lose my mind and my religion. Call him everything but a child of God and a friend of mine. And he says, I just wanted to see if she was still here. Who? The lady. And I'm like, oh, you have to explain this. Apparently, back in the 1950s, an African American cleaning lady was in the theater cleaning up before day's event started. She was attacked and assaulted on the stairs on that landing. During the assault, she hit her head on one of those concrete, on one of the metal lips, had a skull fracture, and passed away. They didn't find her body for a couple of hours, and she was deceased when they found her. And apparently her attacker was a white male, because she doesn't like white men. Ladies can come up and down the staircase, no issues at all, but I do not recommend going if you're a white guy, because if she doesn't choke you, she'll slap you, she'll scratch you, she'll try to push you down the stairs. She does not like white guys. That is also the place I was on stage doing a play called The Weir, and I was cast of all things as an Irish guy. And this is my Irish accent I'm doing for y'all right now. And it's authentic, isn't it? And I'm on stage, and one of the things I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to tell a ghost story that's in the play. And I'm telling the story, and I look up above the audience, and there are 2 big light poles on the front of the balcony now, part about 10 feet high, with various light standards on them. The one on the left-hand side of the stage, there's a guy standing like this, wearing a green shirt, horn-rimmed glasses, and brown pants. Now, there's not really room for where he's standing for a guy to be. And the other problem is there's apparently a light pole growing out of the top of his head because he's standing in the middle of the light fixture. He stands there, and of course, once I see him, I can't look away. I'm frozen looking at the guy. When I finished the ghost story and turned to speak to my fellow actor on stage, out of the corner of my eye, I'd noticed that I don't see him anymore. My guess is he's probably an old manager of the movie theater, who had just kind of come to see, what are you talking about? What are you trying to stir up in my theater? And then he left. The last one I'm going to do is from North Carolina, and it's probably the most famous ghost story from the North Carolina mountains, the Brown Mountain Lights. Brown Mountain Lights have been seen since 1750 or so. The earliest version of the story is there was a battle on Brown Mountain for hunting rights between the Catawba and the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokee won because they had 2 braves left, and the Catawba only had 1. And the lights on the mountain are supposedly the torches of the widows and children and sisters of the dead trying to find their beloved's bodies. Now, if you want to go see the Brown Mountain Lights, you have to go on Blue Ridge Parkway and drive down to mile marker 310, Wiseman's View Overlook. The Wiseman family owned the area that is now the overlooking the Brown Mountain. And a member of that family named Scotty Wiseman wrote a story about Brown Mountain lights. And in his version, a hunter from Charleston came up hunting deer with a slave before the Civil War. During the hunt, the master walked off the side of a cliff, fell to his death, and I hate this saying, faithful old slave still walks looking for the body of his master. And what you're seeing is the light from his torch as he's looking for the body. Another version is after the Civil War, 2 children went out berry picking and walked off the side of another cliff on the mountain and fell. And you're seeing the kerosene lantern that their father carried when he was trying to find their bodies. But it's a really cool story, and it's one of those things where if you go, you will probably have a paranormal experience. Now, full disclosure, when you go, and Brown Mountain's not this huge mountain, it's a little hump about like this. Got some straggly pine trees and oak trees on it. So it looks kind of like a comb standing up on the edge like this. About a half mile away from the upper loop. When you're looking at it in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a flashing red light. This is not a ghost. This is a cell phone tower so you can Facebook Live your experience at Brown Mountain. But of course, the government on all levels cannot leave things well enough alone. So they investigated Brown Mountain. First version was very simple. The Coast and Geodetic Survey around 1890 came up and said, it's easy. We figured out what it is. It's the reflection of the refraction of the diffusion of the kerosene headlamps on railroad engines going across the trestle in Old Fort, North Carolina, which is about 20 miles west of crow flies. Okay, I'll buy that. 1903, the Pacolet River floods. Takes out every railroad trestle between Asheville and Columbia. I mean, it's a 1,000-year flood. It's huge. In Clifton, South Carolina, a 4-story cotton mill built out of stone was completely wiped out. I mean, it carried looms and bodies from Clinton almost to Columbia, like big, huge steel cotton looms. So yeah, this is not the creek stuff. This is a huge flood. Wipes out the trestle at Old Fort. 3 days later, here are the lights. Strike one for the government. And like I said, Brown Mountain lights are not huge, giant fireballs the size of the sun. They're like a blue bottle rocket, green sparkler, orange squiggle, and they can last anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple minutes. Just pip, 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 pip. And second try, in the 1920s, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture came up and looked and said, oh, we've got it figured out. It's swamp gas. What happens is the leaves fall off the trees in puddles of water, and as they rot, it sends up bioluminescent blips, and that's all. It's just swamp gas. Like I say, I'm a hiker, I'm a camper, I've been out in the woods at night, and all this stuff, and I've seen swamp gas. You have to be paying attention, and it's like a little poof, like somebody flicks a light. I mean, it doesn't last long enough to even notice. And it's certainly not bright enough to be seen from a half mile away. So, strike two for the government. My favorite explanation comes in the early 1950s. The Atomic Energy Commission does a study trying to find radioactive material so we can build nuclear weapons. In fact, to the point where if you wrote a letter to the Atomic Energy Commission, they would send you your own Geiger counter so you could look for some yourself. And they did a study that said that Brown Mountain has a core of pure uranium that's like 20 tons, and that's what it is. And when that off gases or the half-life works, it sparks off and makes. Well, I'm a student of history. I must have missed the part where we dropped the limestone bomb on Baghdad back during Gulf War, because there ain't no uranium or anything else in Brown Mountain. It's limestone. It's a rock mountain. It's not radioactive, anything. So, yeah, all I know is if I go to Brown Mountain and I park my car, and I've probably been up there 2 dozen times in my lifetime, the odds are really good. And I probably think 20 out of 24 times I'll see bloop, bloop, squiggle, 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 bloop. Don't know what it is. Don't care. It's the coolest thing I have ever seen. And with that, it's a quarter after. I've been going for way longer than y'all wanted. Thank y'all very much for coming out. I appreciate you listening to me, and happy Halloween, everybody. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Tally, so much for those frightening, spooky tales. Does anyone have any questions? I'm going to see if I can unmute the. Yep, you can all unmute yourselves if you want. We'll give it a couple minutes. Raise your hand if you have something in the chat. If you can't unmute yourself, just put it in the chat. And while we're waiting, I'm just going to let you know that we do have some more events coming up. So follow us on our social media channels, subscribe to our e-newsletters. Our next event that we have coming up is another author event. It's coming up on November 1st at 6. John Harris will be talking about his book, The Last Slave Ships, New York and the End of the Middle Passage. So register for that if that sounds interesting to you. And we'll just give it a few more minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments.
I have a question, if that's okay. So Tally, I know you've done a lot of research in history for a lot of the stories. And I think you have a collection of fiction as well. Do you ever think about writing more fiction, sort of inspired by some of the stories you've learned?
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of things. But yeah, fiction and nonfiction are two very different things. So it takes me longer to get my fiction together. But yeah, I'm working on some things, and I'm hoping to have some more stories come out next year. Of course, you know, with all the craziness that's gone on in the last few years, folks' motivations seem to come and go. So I'm hoping that next year I'll be able to get a little bit more, be a little more productive, as they say. So, but I've definitely used ghost stories and some of the stories in Creek Walking and different things. So yeah.
All right, thank you for that question. And the link to purchase Tally's books is in the chat. And so you'll be able to click through and find his books, or you can just search for his name, Tally Johnson, on Amazon, and you'll be able to get to all of his books from there. And we're very excited to hear that you're coming out with that new book with the Revolutionary War.
And I will say, and I'm a library person as well. Libby has a couple of my books as ebooks, if y'all do that, and I believe the SC Lens Consortium has multiple copies as well if you want to test drive them before you go buy one. So
yes, definitely take advantage of your library system. Yep, do that. So if no one has any more questions, I think we'll end the meeting. If you do, just quickly raise your hand. You use that little one of the emojis. And if no one has any more questions, we'll just give it another few seconds or so. And then we will just thank Tally Johnson again for those spooky tales to get us in the mood for the Halloween season.
well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate it and I enjoyed it.
All right. Yeah, we really appreciated having you. All right, so it looks like I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't hear anyone asking questions, so we will just end it there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again.
All right, y'all have a good night. Thank y'all.